So hello there guys, and welcome back to a brand new episode of the DNF1 Podcast. I hope that you guys are well, and what a Grand Prix weekend that we have just had. The penultimate race of the season, at a point where you might think that there is very little to play for. How wrong could you be? We had it all this weekend. We had changeable conditions. We had a Haas driver on pole position. We had a sprint race for the ages. We had a first maiden win for a brand new driver this weekend, and the first win for Mercedes this season. If you haven't figured out what we're talking about, it's George Russell's day. His first official win in the Formula One World Championship, taking the victory at Sao Paulo not once but twice after winning the sprint weekend as well. And what an incredible race that we had. We had so much controversy. We had inter-team battles at almost every single team this weekend, with a lot of spicy radio exchanges from both sides of those garages to talk about going into not only next weekend's finale at Abu Dhabi, but plenty more races to come in 2023. Joining me on this episode of the podcast, looking forward to talking all things Mercedes and, of course, the rest of the field where other stories may lie, is Courtney Pine. Courtney, I can see you're beaming with pride this weekend. It's been a tough season for Mercedes. They've really had to slug it out. But how must you be feeling right now seeing George Russell, hailing from Kings Lynn, the first British driver to have the new national anthem, God Save the King, playing for him as a race winner in Formula One?
First of all, Adam, just like to give props to your intro. I couldn't have put it any better myself, so pat on the back for that, mate. But yeah, no, it's fantastic. I know a lot of people have been enjoying Mercedes struggles this season, and I think that really was, a great effort from the team throughout the season. I've said this so many times. The experimentation with setup that both drivers, they sacrificed their race weekends to, develop the car and take it in the right direction, not only for this year, but for, 2023 and beyond. And it looks like it's finally starting to pay dividends. Obviously, a British one too. Fantastic stuff. I think it's not only fantastic for Mercedes and Mercedes fans, but I'm really hoping that with Mercedes catching up with Ferrari and Red Bull, obviously there are a lot of things that come into play, and we won't know until March next season. But let's hope that for what we're seeing this weekend is a sign of things to come in 2023, because we have been begging for three teams in a championship battle for a very long time now. Probably go back as far as 2012, maybe, or maybe 2010, or probably as far back as that, since we've had like a proper three-way team battle. So let's hope let's put it this way. Let's hope that this is a sign of things to come, because we've seen that when we get good races like this, we're seeing great battles, and we're also seeing the drama. We love to see the drama. Within reason, let's keep it offline. Let's keep the drama on the track and keep it offline. But yeah, let's keep this going for 2023, because this is exactly what F1 needs moving forward.
Yeah, I must say, I thought it was an incredible performance from George Russell this weekend. He seemed to be, at this point now, I think following the sprint race victory yesterday, which of course technically doesn't contribute to the overall F1 statistics or in the history books. Yes, it will go down as a sprint victory, not a Grand Prix victory. But it just felt today that after he'd got that proverbial monkey off his back, if you like, for pardoning a better phrase, to put it lightly, it did seem that George had got that off his shoulders, managed to get his head down, and he drove a phenomenal race this weekend. Had to make some important moves when they count, of course, starting from the front of the grid, pole position today. He got a great start off the line despite the pressure from his teammate early on. And then, of course, he just drove the race. He ran off into the distance, driving so comfortably, so well. Very similar hallmarks to what we saw in Sakir. Of course, we got the safety car towards the end of the race under incredible pressure. This time, however, he managed to consolidate and get that victory. Despite everything that was thrown against him, he got the job done. And I must say, I was massively impressed by George Russell. I think for me, it was the hallmarks of a perfect drive, quite frankly. Not just today in the sprint as well, where he had to make those overtakes on Max Verstappen on the Saturday afternoon when we saw the sprint. Of course, we're going to be talking a little bit about the sprint race this weekend and why it does serve to be a good a good measuring stick or barometer for what we should hope for sprint races in the future, seeing as we're going to be getting more of them. In my mind, it was a great start from George Russell. Great getaway, very little wheel spin, managed to drive off into the distance, managed the strategy very, very well. He looked after the tyres pretty well. Obviously, the team advising him on the strategy. It did seem like it had to change a little bit. Always had Perez at arm's length. Got a little bit of luck because, of course, what happened between Max Verstappen and Sir Lewis Hamilton, which, of course, we also got a little bit later on about that particular incident. It did get rid of two of his immediate rivals, but when the safety car came out, it felt that all of George's hard work had been undone. But the manner in which he handled that safety car restart today and built up a gap over his teammate, which prevented him from getting DRS, which we know is oh so powerful in Brazil. And Sir Lewis Hamilton loves an overtake in Brazil with DRS. That, for me, was the cherry on the top of a very delicious cake. It was a great performance from George Russell, and this could be the start of things to come. Maybe not necessarily this season, because we've only got one race left, but in 2023, the confidence is going to be so high for George Russell. We may see this being a regular thing.
I'm glad you mentioned Sakir in 2020, because I remember the feelings surrounding George Russell, before everything went wrong for him in the race. He got thrusted into Mercedes team. Don't want to sound too dramatic, because obviously he was he was always a part of the team before he joined Williams. So he's always been a part of the Mercedes family. So yes, when Lewis caught COVID, him joining was abrupt, but it wasn't like he was a complete stranger to the team. However, he went in that weekend, blew his own teammate off the park, was dominating the race. Yes, the W11 we know was on a different stratosphere compared to the rest of the field, but he came in, he completely overpowered Valtteri Bottas, and we really thought this is the next superstar. Because we've been sort of blessed with the new potential superstars coming in with Max Verstappen, Charles Leclerc. There's always been a lot of hype around Lando Norris, who's yet to really be able to showcase that yet. And then along came George Russell as well, and then obviously it all went wrong. We all felt gutted for the guy. So I think it's not just the fact he's got a race win. It's almost like a redemption. You mentioned the monkey off the back. I think it's even more so for George Russell after what happened in 2020. So yeah, absolutely thrilled for the guy. And you're right, Adam. He has the potential to challenge for championship. It's going to be really interesting to see where Mercedes are next season. And look, I think the dynamic between George and Lewis is also going to be interesting if Mercedes develop a race-winning car, because the dynamic's great between them at the moment. George does have a lot of respect for Lewis. He's been very vocal about being a fan of his since he was a kid. But it would be interesting to know what would happen if them two were battling for a championship. But look, let's just enjoy a fantastic race weekend. And I think there is a lot to celebrate, because the last few races have been dull, to say the least. We all thought that this season was just going to sort of, phase out, be a non-event. But this weekend, we got quite the opposite. And it isn't just at the very front. We saw drama. We saw great battles pretty much throughout the grid. So F1 2022, I've been very critical of, because it's been boring in the second half of the season, in my opinion. But we've been getting some well-needed entertainment, and it truly is great to see.
Yeah, absolutely right. And I couldn't agree with you more. Obviously, this does bode well for next season, providing, of course, that we have Red Bull, Mercedes, and Ferrari, at least, all in the mix fighting. And at points this weekend, we did get a lot of that. And I think the Brazilian Grand Prix as a venue, does provide plenty of opportunities, not necessarily to be an equaliser, but a venue that provides opportunities for plenty of close racing, plenty of dramatic moments. We certainly got a lot of those this weekend, of course, and plenty of talking points heading into the season's finale, as I'm sure we will get answers to as the week goes ahead. Obviously, we can talk forever about George Russell here. Obviously, in the championship now, he's currently on 265 points, P4. He's 25 points behind Leclerc and Perez. Obviously, one race less than Perez, 2 races less than Leclerc, so we obviously can't get Leclerc on countback. He's 25 points ahead of Sir Lewis Hamilton, who at this point in time, Lewis would have to win the final race of the season to get ahead of his teammate. At the very least, Corny, I know there are lots of caveats in place here, so I'm not going to pretend that there aren't any regarding the reason why Sir Lewis Hamilton is 25 points off his teammate this season. But for George in his debut season to beat the 7-time world champion in the same car, no caveats included, of course, that's still going to be mightily impressive, even though it's probably just going to be P4 for him.
Yeah, I don't think he's going to be doing an Esteban Ocon and just sort of just looking at the table without any kind of context and go, yeah, look, everyone, have a look at
He's
that.
like, I am the captain now, yeah.
But basically, I think really for George Russell, it's been obviously a very tough season for Mercedes. And I think, yeah, he will be satisfied with himself privately that he is going to finish ahead of Lewis Hamilton. But I think at the same time, I think both himself and Lewis will be really satisfied that, you know, the early sacrifices they made earlier on in the season to get, to find the answers to the issues with the car. I said this before, have taken them to where they are now and hopefully continue to build on to next season. So I think, yeah, George will be chuffed. He's got a race win. Obviously, Mercedes will be chuffed. They've got a race win as well. But I think it's also the journey that they've been on to get them back in that position because obviously, it's been amazing for them how they've been managed to win season in, season out. But it must have got boring even for them. It got boring for a lot of the fans. It must have got boring even for them at one point. So for them to have this like a brand new challenge, yeah, they wouldn't like losing. It was like a whole new challenge for the team. And as I think both drivers have a lot to basically made a big contribution to where the Mercedes has sort of come from to where it is now. So I think George Russell will be happy for himself for more reasons than just a race win and the points total this season.
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, Mercedes will still be keeping an eye on P2 in the Constructors' Championship. This is a very good weekend for them. They got first and third in the sprint race, which was worth 14 points to them compared to Ferrari. Obviously got less. They got P2 for Carlos Sainz, and I think Leclerc was, P6, I think it was, or something like that. Mm-hmm. And, on top of that, a 1-2 and the fastest lap as well. Ferrari finishing third and fourth. So, credit to Ferrari. They did a great job to recover that despite considering where they were early in the race when we thought Leclerc was going to be out of the Grand Prix, let alone actually, someone said he would finish P4 when he found himself in the wall after what happened with Norris. I think he'd have been chopped at a bit to get that. Absolutely. The championship position now for those two is 19 points. Ferrari will beat Mercedes on countback, so Mercedes will have to outscore Ferrari by 20 points at the Abu Dhabi Grand Prix this weekend. A similar result for Mercedes, bear in mind that there's no sprint race in Abu Dhabi, will not be enough to overturn that. And going into next season, you mentioned already, Courtney, the journey that Mercedes went on, the development that went on their car this season. Mattia Binotto, Christian Horner, plenty others have said that Mercedes have spent a lot of time developing their 2022 car. Granted, most of it was to find out what the issue was with their car as to why they were struggling. They know where the issues are. They just need to now work on their car to eradicate those and continue to improve it. Is there a fear that even if Mercedes don't finish in P2 and they get the extra development time, will they be potentially under the cosh to be on a level playing field with Red Bull and Ferrari next season? Is there a fear that they may be still compromised because of their aggressive development for 2022 and sacrificing potentially 2023?
I think, first of all, there is going to be more expectation from the fan base and even the drivers and even some people within the team to, develop a race-winning car after what's happened over the last few races. But at the same time, I'd be more concerned if we saw this from Mercedes in 2021, because obviously there's just been a complete overhaul of the cars, completely new concepts. But with 2022 under 2023, they are just an evolution of these new cars. So it's not going to be as much of a sort of risk moving on to next season, because anything that they learn about this year's car should benefit the 2023 car. We all know that going into every season, the particular teams at the top come up with new tricks to gain an advantage. So, look, I'm not going to pretend that Mercedes are like they're now fully back, because you'd be foolish to, forget about the likes of Red Bull and Ferrari, because, they weren't at the front at the beginning of the season for no reason. So there is still work for Mercedes to do. But you'd like to think that they are at least going to be there or thereabouts. And I think that's what they was aiming for when I was struggling at the beginning. So I think there's cause for optimism for 2023. But now expectations are going to be higher. So there will be more pressure on the team to deliver.
Yeah, I think so too. And I don't think we should undersell what Mercedes are achieving right now, just because they have a very fast car, arguably the second fastest car behind Red Bull, and a very, very strong race car based on what we saw this weekend. At the end of the season, doesn't mean that they're not going to have a good car in 2023. We're in a new set of regulations. We don't know how steep the development curve is going to be. For all we know, teams could reach their peak by the end of next season, or maybe even before that. We haven't seen a lot of change from Ferrari in some time, so there is an expectation there that Ferrari are going to improve. Whether that happens or not, we don't know. Red Bull as well, although it's quite mind-boggling to imagine how much better Red Bull's car can really get right now, considering how dominant they have been for some time this season. So it's not a situation where I feel like I personally should be downplaying what Mercedes are doing. I think we should be crediting them massively. There is always going to be that concern until we see the cars roll out next season, especially given the expectation we had with Mercedes. None of us expected Mercedes to be so far off the pace. It almost kind of edifies how impressive Mercedes' resurgence has been this season, and the fact that they have tried so many different solutions, a myriad of ideas and concepts that haven't worked. They seem to have finally found a way to get the most out of this W13 right now, and who knows, it could prove to ultimately be the best concept going forward with these different philosophies. We don't know yet, but Mercedes' upward trajectory cannot be ignored. Maybe that's going to be a good sign for him going forward. We'll just have to wait and see. Looking at Sir Lewis Hamilton's race, voted driver of the day today, with respect to the 7-time world champion, I would argue strongly that George Russell probably deserved it just a little bit more than his illustrious counterpart. But overall, I think we can agree, Courtney, that despite certain situations in this race which held him back, I think Sir Lewis Hamilton did a great job today to get that 1-2, was allowed to race all the way to the end, get the big points for the team, and as we saw last year, Courtney, he just seems to love racing around Brazil right now.
Yeah, I think he's always been the type of driver that likes to get stuck in, and I think Brazil's the sort of circuit, where you're able to do that. So I think Brazil's definitely the kind of circuit that suits Lewis, and it's just very reminiscent of last year, the way that he had early setbacks, not as severe this season, nowhere near as severe. But he had two bites of the cherry with the sprint race, and he performed well in both the sprint race and the actual race itself. But yeah, I just think again this another weekend from Lewis where you had people at the beginning of the season say relishing in Mercedes and Lewis's struggles, saying that Lewis is a finished driver. Yet again, Lewis has proven he still has plenty to offer. And again, I just think it's going to be really, really interesting. I'm really excited to see where the Mercedes story goes from here, because you've got the questions around Lewis. Can Lewis still deliver? Obviously, I personally think he can. And then also you've got the George Russell dynamic. How's that going to evolve with Mercedes are there? And also, are we going to see Lewis Hamilton versus Max Verstappen part 2? Or are we going to see Lewis Hamilton, Max Verstappen, George Russell and Charles Leclerc? I mean, it really is mouth-watering. I know I shouldn't get carried away. We're not going to know for another 3 or 4 months. But the way that the trajectory of the teams have been heading, we are heading into that kind of, that mindset. Could we see these battles next season? Because I'm fanboying here, but it would be amazing. It really would.
Well, speaking of incidents between Sir Lewis Hamilton and Max Verstappen, whilst we haven't had many of them this season, and you'd be forgiven if you're a new F1 fan for wondering, what is all this about with Sir Lewis Hamilton and Max Verstappen from 2021? I wasn't watching this, so what are you guys talking about? What are we looking forward to in 2023? Well, we kind of got a bit of a taster of that today, didn't we? We obviously they did lock horns in the sprint race, although arguably Max was on the wrong tyres and had a damaged car as well, although we don't know the extent of that damage, so we can't really judge how much he was affected, but it certainly looked that way. In the main race, the two of them locked horns again, and they come together again, and it was very dramatic. One of those incidents that we've seen quite often last season between these two, which polarized opinion. And even when we were talking about this, Courtney, we tend to have different takes on these. No better, no worse, just different. And very interesting incident between these two. Going into turn 1, Lewis had the inside line. Max went very bold round the outside, was ahead of Lewis just a bit, but Lewis managed to hold the line and stay ahead, but was not fully ahead going into turn 2. Max was alongside Lewis going into turn 2, and the two collided. Max was given a 5-second time penalty by the stewards for causing a collision. Without delaying it any further, Corny, what did you make of that incident? Do you think they've got that one right, or do you think there was more to it than that?
I think this runs a lot deeper. I think, look, the history between the two drivers. I mean, I don't even have to go there. But this goes back, and I remember, Adam, we discussed this on podcasts at the beginning of 2021 about Max's driving style when it comes to battling other drivers. Max does put the car in a position at times where you go, you either let me through or we're going to crash. And at the beginning of 2021, Lewis sort of went along with with Max's style and sort of thought, well, I'll let Max through at the beginning and see if I can get him later on in the race. As the battle in the championship went on and the stakes were becoming higher, Lewis was obviously thinking, sod that, I'm not going to be playing to Max's rules anymore, and I'm going to put myself in the same position. And I think this is what's happening now between the two drivers, that now they're both compromising each other now, because they're both going, if you're going to do it, I'm going to do it too. So now we've got a situation where you're going to see them come together. And, Max commented very early on in the season, his battles with Charles Leclerc is different. We're not going to be battling the way that I was with Lewis. And that's because Lewis isn't going to sort of put up with Max's almost bully tactics, I'd like to say. But yeah, I just think, again, we're going to be seeing more of that next season if Mercedes are there. And it's mouth-watering. I just don't want all of the sort of toxicity and drama online. I love the drama on track, but I like it to stay on track. But yeah, with the incident itself, I was surprised that Max got a 5-second penalty. And I just wonder if that was a bit of a message from the stewards. That, obviously Max does have a bit of a reputation. And I'm just wondering if they were slightly harsh on him. Just to give him a reminder, in future battles, going in again next season, just giving Max a reminder, if you're going to do certain things on track, you are going to get punished for it. So I'm just wondering if that was a bit of a feeler from the stewards for future reference.
Yeah, it very much is a 50-50 one, isn't it? Because we were talking about this in our WhatsApp messages as the race was going on. And I don't agree with the stewards' decision to award Max a 5-second penalty. I certainly don't agree with the fact that Max was not to blame for this incident. I don't, however, feel that this was 100% on one driver. There's so many different arguments that we can make. Yeah. I'm sure we will see in the coming days and even weeks when people analyse this incident to death, and people that claim to be expert drivers or people that know racing versus people that know this or know that. Everyone throws their credentials at this, when in reality, it doesn't really matter. We're all just fans. We all have the same level of opinion, whether we are a guy that didn't quite make it for whatever reason in Formula One versus someone that's tuned into their first F1 race. It doesn't really matter. But at the same time, part of me kind of feels that this is one of those scenarios where, not implying that the stewards did this because of this, but the stewards didn't give Max a 5-second penalty for running Lewis out wide at turn 4 last season. I thought they should have done then. I don't think they should have done it today, and they gave him a 5-second penalty today. So this is kind of not necessarily karma, as Fernando Alonso once put it, but in a weird way, it's kind of like six of one and half a dozen of the other here. With this particular incident, I will add my 2 cents onto this. Not throwing any credentials in there, as I've already mentioned jokingly about others that have done quite similar in the past. I feel that in this incident, at no point was Lewis far enough ahead of Max to warrant Max giving him the room in the corner. Now, because of the way that corner goes, and we saw a similar incident with Max and Esteban Ocon a couple of years ago when the two of them collided, although that was different because Ocon was a lap down. Why was he trying to unlap himself? Max didn't really give him the room on the outside. He kind of closed in on him. Something similar happened here today. And for me, I think Max was far enough alongside Lewis to be given more racing room than Sir Lewis offered him. But at the same time, Courtney, I think you make an excellent point about Max Verstappen in that and arguably this is probably his only flaw in an otherwise perfect arsenal of abilities that Max Verstappen has acquired over the years, is the fact that he does more often than not put himself in a position where he relies on the other driver to make concessions to avoid an accident. Now, this isn't a criticism of Max, because other great drivers of the past have done this too. Ayrton Senna, Michael Schumacher, Sir Lewis Hamilton in his younger days used to do this, and you could argue that when he fights Max Verstappen now, he does do that. You know, you already pointed that out. It happened in Monza, happened at Silverstone, because he doesn't want Max to bully him out of position. The same thing's happened again today. And in my mind, I think it should have just gone down as a racing incident. Max suffered the jeopardy of damage to his car, which ruined his race completely. He got to the back of the field. Fortunately for Lewis, he was able to carry on. His car seemed relatively intact and it didn't compromise him that much. Yes, he had to recover it. Could he have won the race today if it weren't for that? Maybe. I don't know. But I don't think the stewards made the right call. I mean, they definitely weren't going to blame Sir Lewis, because now he's an honorary Brazilian citizen. There was absolutely no way that they were going to get out of the Interlagos if they'd have given Sir Lewis Hamilton a 5-second penalty, nor should they have done as well. So, I mean, let me know your thoughts in the comments, guys. I know we talk about toxicity in the F1 social media, and we're not accusing you guys of the same. I like to think that 95% of the people that comment on our videos and our opinions on these things and offer their own opinions are people that obviously enjoy the sport very, very much and obviously quite fair in what they say. I don't think there's any other judgment you can make on that. But do let us know in the comment section what you make of that incident. Courtney, did you want to add anything more to that before we move on to the next part?
No, I just think it's another example of, you know, why we could potentially, you know, be excited for next season, because I want to be seeing more of Lewis Hamilton versus Max Verstappen. Again, not the online stuff. But I just feel that you can't end the Lewis Hamilton and Max Verstappen saga in Abu Dhabi. That can't be the way the story ends. You know, so if you invest in, like, I don't know, in a movie or a gaming franchise and you think that's the ending, no, that's too anticlimactic. And we know what that was.
That's just chapter 1.
That's it. We need part 2. We need the sequel. But again, it's just the online stuff. Like I get tired of even like Lewis Hamilton fans sometimes online. But it's just there's having rivalry, you know, and having a dislike for another driver. But you just take it too far. So you make it way too deep. Let's say sometimes it's not as deep as you think it is. I just want to be seeing great battles on track between 2 all-time greats. So please, come on, fingers crossed. Let's have more of that next season.
Oh, absolutely. And there's going to be more sequels to this, absolutely. I mean, right now, the situation Mercedes are in, there's absolutely no reason why Sir Lewis Hamilton won't want to stick around. He seems quite happy to want to stick around for a few more years. Hopefully we'll hear some good news on that in the future. So, yeah, bring it on. Bring it on. I want to see more of that between them two. Hopefully they don't come into contact all the time, but the aggressiveness between the two of them on track, even when there's nothing to play for other than personal pride at this point, because they're not fighting for a world championship this season, it really does whet the appetite, if you like. It really does whet the appetite for 2023. Let's hope those two are going to be in fairly equal competitive machinery next season, along with the Ferrari boys as well, and maybe 1 or 2 others if they're able to make a big enough leap. Unlikely, but you never know. You always got to live in hope. One thing I did want to ask you about, Courtney, this weekend, a lot of talk was on Sir Lewis Hamilton over being honoured with the privilege of being named a honorary citizen of Brazil. And this was something that was mentioned a little while ago, that obviously because of COVID, he wasn't able to just fly over there and have it done. And they had the ceremony for him this week in front of, I think it was Brazilian government, to rapturous applaud from fans and Brazilian citizens and politicians alike. For me, it was something that I don't think I'd ever seen anything like this before. It was very, very strange. I'd never really thought of the idea being possible of someone being named an honorary citizen of a country just like that. And, you know, for a while I just didn't see why they were doing it. But to be honest, after seeing the tributes and hearing or being reminded of the connections that Sir Lewis Hamilton has had to the Ayrton Senna family long after the late great legend had passed away in 1994, and obviously the great works that the two of them do together, 2 huge names of motorsport coming together in the way that they have, and what it obviously means to the Brazilian public. I mean, bear in mind, this is a guy that 14 years ago won the world championship, his first world championship off the top Brazilian driver at the time, Felipe Massa, in the final moments of it. 90th minute winner, up for the corner, header, wins it all. And you can imagine he'd be public enemy number 2 behind Timo Glock, of course. You know, so make of that what you will. But at the same time, to come from that to being heralded as this hero of the people, as this man who everybody in Brazil loved. The cheers that Sir Lewis Hamilton was getting from the crowd this weekend was phenomenal. You'd be kidded for thinking that he was a Brazilian driver at his home race this weekend. It was incredible stuff. To come to that, I've got to say, whilst I didn't get it at first, now that I've had time to think about it, I think it's an absolutely wonderful thing. And it just shows the great impact that the great man himself has made on the Brazilian public and, the wider world as a whole. It really does.
Yeah, I think that we discussed it earlier on. I think a lot of it did start from Lewis being very vocal about his admiration from Ferrari and Senna, not only obviously as a driver nowadays, but also as a kid. I think Lewis was an Ayrton Senna fan, very open about it. Obviously emulating him driving for McLaren, winning the world championship for McLaren. There are a lot of connections between the two drivers. The driving style. Even before Lewis became like a multiple world champion, he was one of the biggest superstars in the sport, always making headlines. And I just think that the Brazilian people have made a connection with Lewis. And obviously, 2008, that would have been a completely different story. But I think also Lewis as a person has obviously grown up a lot since then as well. I think we see people that aren't heavily invested in Formula One or make comments about Lewis Hamilton, and they will judge him as the person that he was when he was racing Fernando Alonso, for example, where there was a lot of incident. He has grown up a lot since then, and I think sometimes you do hear a lot of misconceptions about Lewis because they're making judgments about him 14, 15 years ago. And I think the Brazilian people have actually picked up on this as well. The work that Lewis does behind the scenes. I think it's also great. It was also great to hear the cheers when Lewis was, doing overtakes. Did you think about how much hate this guy has got over the past 18 months, particularly from certain sections of society? We've been seeing, some of the racists coming out of the woodwork, using this as an excuse to attack Lewis. So for him to go to a circuit and to get this much adulation from the crowd, I think it really was genuinely nice to see.
Yeah, I really think so too. Again, I've never ever seen anything like this in my life before. It was a crazy yet wonderful thing to see. And all I can really say, with all respect to the Brazilian fan base, is you can't claim Sir Lewis Hamilton's records. I'm sorry. No. You're more than welcome to claim anything that he does from now on as a joint dual thing with Britain, but no, sorry, you can't, because I saw Brazilian fans jokingly saying, oh, now we've got a 7-time world champion in our ranks with over 100 Grand Prix. I'm like, I don't think that's quite how it works. But no, it's
nice try.
Nice try. It's all fun and games, but no, as I said, wonderful thing to see. And, it was obviously really important for Sir Lewis as well, how upbeat he was, how happy he was about this, talking to his family about this sort of thing is something that's, again, seemed quite surreal to even imagine it, let alone see it. But no, wonderful thing. And of course, we saw a famous mural of Ayrton Senna that was painted in the local area. We saw another one of Sir Lewis Hamilton painted by the same artist, I believe, which I think Lewis went to visit and signed himself. So absolutely wonderful sight to see. Great stuff indeed. Let's move on to some more controversy. Red Bull, a team that always seems to be involved in some controversy one way or the other. However, this time it's purely about stuff happening on the track. Now, yesterday in the sprint race, we had Sergio Perez trying to get past his teammate in order to get more points in the Drivers' Championship over Charles Leclerc. And they're currently battling for P2 right now. Of course, he wasn't able to do that at the time because he wasn't close enough to his teammate, and there was quite a bit of a threat. I know a lot of people were comparing this to what happened in Spain, where Checo was asked to let Max go. But back then, Max was going a lot faster than Checo was at the time, and the gap was much wider to the cars behind. Yesterday, Checo was only 1.8 seconds behind at the start lap 24. Charles Leclerc was right on his tail. It wasn't a big enough buffer to make that move, so I thought, fair enough. I don't really think it would have been fair to ask Max to move out of the way. Fast forward to today. Checo arguably didn't do too much wrong today. He just didn't have the pace to beat George Russell or the Mercedes. And even Carlos Sainz. Ferrari got Red Bull on strategy today. And that's something else we'll talk about a little bit later on, because I wasn't expecting to talk about that today. We get to the end of the race. Max Verstappen ahead of his teammate, because Checo obviously was on the wrong strategy at the wrong time with the safety car. He was left out on old mediums. It really didn't work out for him. He'd been overtaken by not only the two, well, not so much Russell, but Hamilton, Sainz, even Fernando Alonso and Charles Leclerc got ahead of him. Towards the end of the race, Max Verstappen ahead of Checo overtook him. It did seem that if Max wasn't able to get Alonso at the end of the race, he'd have allowed Checo to re-overtake him at the end to get a few extra points, which at this point, Courtney, would have been enough to put him in P2 in the Drivers' Championship. As it were, Max ignored the radio call that came in and said to him, Max, and basically they asked Max Verstappen, Max, what happened there? And Max basically said, I told you already last time, don't ask that again to me. Are we clear about that? I gave my reasons and I stand by it. Now, Checo's obviously had a lot to say on it, and we'll talk about that a little bit later on, but given where we are this season, Courtney, Checo currently tied P2 with Leclerc, behind on race wings if we go back on countback. 1 point really could make the difference, something that Max Verstappen knows a lot about in terms of fine margins from previous successes of his. And after everything that Checo has really done in terms of supporting his teammate when he's asked to, that's going to be a real kick in the teeth for Checo Perez. I mean, are we talking about the moment right now where this Red Bull partnership could potentially break beyond the point of no return?
Yeah, and very much a very vital time, because if all the hype I've been drumming up throughout this podcast comes to fruition, Max is going to need Sergio's help on many occasions next season. So I don't think it was the wisest move from Max. You know, you got to think long term in this F1 game. You know, and I just think that Max had already had the championship wrapped up. You know, I'd understand if Max was still in the championship battle like we saw earlier on in the season. Absolutely. But I just think that Sergio Perez is the only person that has anything to lose in this situation right now. So I think it was poor from Max. It really was poor. And, you know, like, I think people gun for me in the comments because obviously I'm seen as the Mercedes fanboy. But I've been very vocal about how I feel that Max has matured a lot after last season, and I'll be honest, I'm getting doubts again. I'm just wondering if I've only been seeing a more mature Max Verstappen because he hasn't been getting challenged. You know, he's had one bad weekend, and he seems to have got caught up in the incidents like we saw last season. And falling out with your teammate, who's been a good asset to the team, isn't the way to go. I'm sure that obviously Christian Horner's been, you know, on TV saying that, you know, he wants to keep things internal and they've already shaken hands, this, that, and the other. But I don't think this is the end of it. And it's going to be interesting to see how that, again, we're talking about Lewis Hamilton and George Russell. It's going to be interesting to see how that dynamic goes next season, because when you've got, you know, a close championship battle between other teams, you need your driver dynamic to be spot on to give you that advantage. So, yeah, certainly interesting times for the Red Bull team. It seems to be, as you said, Adam, seems to be one drama after another with that team. They can't keep themselves out of the headlines.
Yeah. Well, at least this time it's for something that's happened on track rather than all the stuff that we've been talking about for the last weeks and months, really, off the track and more in the accounting office. You know, Checo was understandably frustrated by this. He obviously was aware of the situation. He has been aware of it all weekend. For him, his goal is very simple. He's done his job to get the Constructors' Championship. He's done his job at times to support his teammate. In hindsight, yes, it probably wouldn't have really mattered that much, his efforts, but at the time they were relevant and they were important. It did help his teammate win races. It did help his teammate build a buffer, which ultimately led to him becoming the 2022 world champion. You could argue to a degree he did do a big job last season. And I think Checo alluded on this because there was an interview with Spanish F1 media where Checo basically said, roughly translated, I don't understand why Max didn't give me the position after all I've done for him. If he has 2 world championships, it is because of me. And this was in a post-race interview. Now, we're not, obviously, we don't believe for a second that Checo is basically saying that if it was for him, Max wouldn't be a world champion. But he's obviously referring to moments, as we mentioned earlier, the Spanish Grand Prix we talked about earlier in the season, where he had to give up the place to allow Max to take the race win at a time where Charles Leclerc was leading the world championship and was on the verge of extending that lead before his reliability troubles ended a race which looked his to win. And Max obviously was overtaking Checo to take the win himself. We also saw a few other occasions this season where Checo's had to play that game for his teammate. Abu Dhabi, obviously a famous example last season. The job that Checo did to hold up Sir Lewis Hamilton, compromising his own race just to help Max back in it. Of course, with hindsight, we know that because of what happened, it ultimately didn't really matter. But at the time, it was still relevant. It got his team back. It's got his driver back into the race. So after all of that, I totally understand why Checo's annoyed. And I totally agree with you, Corny. I don't understand, even though Max is, understandably frustrated after how his weekend ended up today. He was obviously looking to try and win another Grand Prix, perhaps take the outright record of percentages of races won, with the exception of Alberto Ascari. Of course, that would have been on his mind. I don't think he can do that now, because he had to win the last 2 races to do that. So obviously he would have had his mindset on that. It's been a frustrating weekend. I just feel, as you mentioned already, Corny, after everything Checo's done for Max Verstappen, the fact that Max has done this could cause issues in the future when he's in a position himself next season, as I'm sure he will be, to try and get race wins or to get points when he needs to if it's damage and limitation. Checo probably will feel he's in his rights to say, you know what, forget this. I know what he did to me when I needed him to help me out. Why should I help him? So it has the potential to cause frictions. We saw Christian Horner, respond to this. He basically said that, they work as a team, they race as a team. Our objective and priority is to see if we can get Checo to finish runner-up. And Max has given his commitment as well in Abu Dhabi. And, I mean, are we expecting that to happen? A situation where if Checo needs Max to let him through, probably will see it. But, sometimes you only need to get true feelings about someone from their first reaction.
Yeah, well, we saw Sergio Perez's remarks on the team radio afterwards. Again, adrenaline rush could have been said in a moment, but Sergio Perez said himself, "We're seeing Max for who he really is." So for me, that sounds like there's been a little bit of needle, and those kind of feelings don't go away overnight. I'm sure that Red Bull will want to have the happy ending where Max helps Sergio Perez gets second in Abu Dhabi. But I think after what's happened this weekend, I think it's going to take more than just that to heal the wounds. Look, Sergio Perez, he's a mature driver. He's an experienced driver. I don't think he's going to do anything silly. But I think there will be a reluctance to help Max. He'll be thinking about the team, of course, but particularly at the beginning of the season, if there's race wins available or big points finishes available for Sergio, I think he will hesitate in helping Max because he will start thinking about himself more, and rightly so after what happened this weekend.
Yeah, and if there's anything that we know from watching Formula One for as long as we have, is that there's definitely no iron team in this case, and no matter how good you are, whether you're Sir Lewis Hamilton or Max Verstappen or other greats of the past, you always need to have your rear gunner there from time to time. There will be days where you need your number 2 driver in your team to back you up to help you win a world championship. Now, as I said, with retrospect and hindsight, Checo's contributions, whilst admirable and important at the time, ultimately were irrelevant towards the end of the season when the championships were wrapped up in the manner that they were. But it doesn't lessen the significance of what he's done. What it does do, as I said already, is create potential frictions where next season, where Max may rely on those to win world championships, and if he misses out by the narrowest of margins, he will remember those moments and say, well, Checo didn't do this or Checo didn't do that. Maybe he'll come to regret today. I don't know. We'll have to see. I'm not sure if we're going to be in a situation where Max will be able to redeem himself in Abu Dhabi. You never really know, quite honestly, but we'll have to wait and see next weekend. But if we end up going into the winter break at the end of the season and Charles Leclerc is P2 in the Drivers' Championship, that's going to sting. And that's going to hurt Checo Perez. And at that point, that could be the moment where Checo decides, forget this, I don't care if this is Max's team, I'm going to race for myself now, and what comes of it comes of it. And that could potentially cost Max a world championship in the future.
Yeah, and I think it's also the way that Max spoke on the radio. Look, we all know that teams have the lead driver, the superstar driver, but the tone in which he was talking on the radio was like, I'm bigger than this team. I'm the golden child. I'm the one who calls the shots. That's how he sounded like on the radio. I'm not saying, before people get on my back, that's how he is in general. I personally think he is, but that kind of tone on a public broadcast again isn't a good look. It just reeks of entitlement. Again, that's just my opinion.
We've seen in the past, not just him, other drivers that sort of for lack of a better way of putting this, throw their toys at the pram and moaning and wanting this and seem like, oh, I deserve this or deserve that. They get reined in by their teams. We've seen it all across the paddock. I mean, remember the British Grand Prix? Charles Leclerc had every right to be angry at his team because they cost him a race victory. Granted, his teammate won the race, so, Ferrari was still happy. But Charles was visibly upset and distraught by the fact that his team basically screwed him over. And literally he had Matteo Binotto putting the arm around him, basically saying, you do not criticise the team. You might be our star driver, but you are not bigger than this team. And Red Bull, even though you could argue they could do the same with Max Verstappen, I've not seen that happen. And again, not to criticise Max Verstappen because I'm a huge fan of his, but every time this sort of things happen, you always get the, we'll talk about this later. We'll talk about this in the debrief. We always have the PR recovery. I mean, whoever the Red Bull PR rep is, I feel for you. They need this winter break more than anyone else, quite frankly. So fair play to them. And, it's something that's going to definitely come into 2023. I know Red Bull fans and Max Verstappen fans and maybe even Checo fans don't want us to say that. I just think at some point next season, we're going to see something that will come from this. It quite often does when we talk about live sports. So we'll have to wait and see, but definitely not a great weekend for the Red Bull team. Ferrari had a similar incident today. Whilst all heavily praised Ferrari for their recovery and their strategy as well. The strategy put signs on the softs when, and obviously the way that race panned out. Sainz drove a great race today. Ultimately, I think it just come down to the fact that two guys in a better car than him this weekend on performance done a better job. I think that's all you can say. But strategy-wise, Ferrari, despite having a bit of a shambles when it comes to qualifying and sprint qualifying, and the sprint race itself, did recover it today. They took advantage of the safety car, got him ahead of Perez, and, if he had a bit more pace or got ahead of Perez early, he may have been a factor in the battle for the race win today. Charles Leclerc, on the other hand, obviously had to recover that incident. I don't think we need to go over the Norris incident. It's quite simply Norris understeered into the corner, hit Leclerc, got a 5-second penalty. Leclerc, very unlucky, very angry, of course, managed to recover it up to P4 brilliantly. So he's done a great job to get back into that position, which of course is important not only for his Drivers' Championship, but also for the Constructors' Championship for Ferrari. He was saying on the radio he wanted Carlos Sainz to move out of the way and give up third place for him. It was very, very dangerous to do that with Alonso right behind him. I don't think Ferrari were going to do it anyway. They didn't ultimately. I think they were right to do that. And it's wrong for them to think to take away a podium as well. It's not like we're asking them two to swap between 6th and 7th like Red Bull with Max and Checo. This was a podium that Carlos Sainz was going to be asked of Charles to surrender. Charles did say, however, that pretty much that this was something that they'd agreed before the race, that if they were in this sort of situation for the championship, that they would agree to do that. And obviously Ferrari, apparently, according to Charles, went against their word on that one. So what did you make of all of that one, Courtney? Do you think Ferrari made the right call?
Yeah, I mean, for once, on the actual race day, they were good. They seem to have got their weekend allocation of mistakes out of the way on the Friday. So so the sprint race kind of aided them in that sense. But it's a tough one. We all know it's a difficult job to manage an F1 team, clearly. But yeah, I don't know. It's really touch and go. It's because it's all well and good putting out a plan for the weekend, but we all know there's so many scenarios that could come into play. And you're right, I completely second what you say, Adam. If it was over like 6th or 7th, yeah, absolutely fair enough. You had an agreement, but you can't be taking a podium away from Carlos Sainz, particularly after which was a really good weekend for him. The weekend could have been even better for him. Let's not forget he got a 5-place grid penalty at the beginning of the race, so it was a really strong weekend for Carlos Sainz, and I think it would have been cruel to take the podium away from him.
Yeah, absolutely. I think he thoroughly deserved it. Of course, the venue where I believe he got his first podium for McLaren a few years back.
Yeah.
So it's been a solid recovery for Ferrari this week. And I think if someone has said to Ferrari, look, Mercedes is going to get a 1-2, they got 3rd and 4th, they'd be like, okay, that's not great, but we'll be happy with that. And I think you've got to applaud Ferrari where you can. It's hard to find positives in a weekend which all the attention has been on Mercedes, understandably, because of the job that they've done. But Ferrari weren't bad this weekend. They were just not great. So I think we can say that much. I mean, they were a bit of a shambles with what they did with Leclerc. They kind of split the two cars on tyre choice with the interchangeable conditions at the during qualifying on Friday. That was a weird one. Put Charles on the Inter. He then went around and did a lap, an actual qualifying lap before he came in, and then he put the softs on, and then we of course got George Russell going off, which ended the session, so Charles was never able to get a soft tyre lap in. Charles wasn't happy about it. There seems to be an onus right now with Ferrari that when they make these calls and they get them wrong, it very much seems to be their decision. Do you feel that, like perhaps Carlos Sainz, he seems to be quite clever at these when he sort of thinks on his feet with these situations. He did the same thing today when he was asking about 2 or 3 stops, what they were going to do, and where Perez was in that race and ultimately beating him in that. I feel sometimes that Charles Leclerc needs to take more responsibility of his own strategies. Now, I know people will say, oh, well, Sir Lewis Hamilton doesn't even get that sometimes. We had it today where Sir Lewis wanted to do something different. He wanted to stay out longer, and Mercedes told him, no, this is what we're doing. We're going to pit a bit earlier. This is what they're doing. Yes, the teams have more foresight on these things, but sometimes when these mistakes happen with Ferrari and Leclerc, I almost feel that perhaps Leclerc should just take responsibility and say, no, this is what we're doing. George Russell did it in Zandvoort. Yeah, all right, he kind of screwed the team a little bit in terms of Lewis, but he got a better result himself. So sometimes maybe there is room for Leclerc to sort of incorporate in his mind, if he feels it's better to do one thing, just do it. You're the guy driving the car. Drive into the pits and change the tyres. Force the team's hand. Because if you don't, we've seen so many times this season when Ferrari get it wrong. Okay, they got it right today on strategy. But the moments where they get it wrong more often than not, you're the one that's suffering for it. And Sainz has kind of gone the other way on this. He's took more responsibility for what he's doing, and he seems to be doing all right at the moment.
Absolutely spot on what you said about, the team that they're racing for. If it was Red Bull, for example, who are clearly the best when it comes to strategy, you go, look, listen, they know what they're doing. But with Ferrari, with the catalogue of errors that they've made this season, you'd be thinking, look, I'm just going to have to have a go myself, see how it goes, because it's a learning curve, isn't it? And it's those kind of scenarios which develop a world champion. We know that Charles Leclerc has the pace to be a world champion, but these other cars are little skills, which I think Carlos Sainz, again, had them spot on. Carlos Sainz has this more in him. Carlos Sainz lacks that bit of stardust in terms of raw talent that Leclerc has, but Leclerc could do with what Carlos Sainz has. A little bit that we saw with Lewis Hamilton against Nico Rosberg. Lewis Hamilton clearly had the raw pace, but during their time together at Mercedes, Nico Rosberg was had more of an understanding with the mechanics of the car. And Lewis learned from that. Those experiences made Lewis a better driver. So these are kind of experiences that Charles Leclerc needs to learn from if he wants to be a world champion, because I know he can race the likes of Max Verstappen and Lewis Hamilton, but he has to add these, this weaponry, let's say, if he wants to be a world champion. Because look, these guys are clearly not easy to beat, so he needs to finesse every aspect of his driving, and this certainly is one part of it he needs to improve.
Yeah, I mean, there's no doubt in the speed that Charles Leclerc has, and when he's fully firing, all cylinders blazing and everything else, he is up there with anybody. He's a match for anybody. I saw an interesting, those tier lists that people tend to make, and you see them like this. I saw one that Aldous, the famous F1 tuber, someone we've had on a few times on the show, he did one. And on that list, he obviously was including, he was rating the drivers in terms of their quality and where they stand in terms of the hierarchy. And Charles Leclerc was, in my opinion, quite generously placed alongside Sir Lewis Hamilton and Max Verstappen as the elite of the elite on the current F1 grid. Now, whilst I don't disagree that in terms of outright speed and talent, Leclerc is in that fight, he's comfortably the third best in that argument right now. I would probably place him in the middle of... It's sort of, if there's a line between where Max and Lewis are and where the ones in the level below, the likes of the Russells, Sainz's, the Alonso's, the Norris's to a degree, Checo, those drivers, somewhere in between there.
Yeah.
And it's those 1% margins, those calls on strategies when you know a bit better and you want to make that call and you get the gamble right, or the composure in certain situations where you're not making mistakes that cost you a race win, like we saw in France, for example. Other things like that, those small little things that Charles Leclerc needs to iron out in order to become a potential world champion, rather than just the modern day Gilles Villeneuve. And I don't mean that to disrespect him. I think anyone that watched Gilles Villeneuve or heard of his legacy will know where I'm kind of going with this. But Charles Leclerc right now, that is something I think he ultimately lacks. And it's been quite evident this season that when others, even his own teammate, have made decisions, we saw Silverstone, Carlos Sainz saying, stop inventing. It was a bit of a joke. But it was that kind of mindset and that attitude that won him the Grand Prix. His teammate, on the other hand, didn't do that, bought into what the team wanted him to do, and it cost him a Grand Prix at the same venue. So there's a lot of positives to take for Ferrari this season. Ultimately, this weekend was a decent one, but obviously it's going to be overshadowed by the fact that their immediate rivals, Mercedes, took a 1-2 and won the sprint race as well. So huge damage on their part. Ultimately, it may come to nothing if Ferrari consolidate P2 in the Constructors, but it's certainly something they have to look at for 2023 if they're going to be successful. So wait and see. On another note, I did want to talk about sprint races just quickly before we move on. Now, this is going to be quite a long one, this episode. We have got a few more topics to talk about. Sprint races, we've heard from a lot of people this season, ourselves included, that sprint races aren't really doing it for F1 fans. I think sometimes the one reason why we probably enjoy watching them or look forward to them is because it's better than watching a practice session on a Saturday morning. And that is a fair point. At the same time, though, I do feel that we need a bit more than that. Brazil, arguably, as I said to you and Lee in the group chat, Brazil is the mecca for F1 sprint races. It's always been a good track for overtaking. We saw that again this weekend, not just last season, but we saw more of it this weekend all across the grid. We didn't just see the Lewis Hamilton show like we saw last season, as fun as that was to watch. Ross Brawn has had his thoughts on this, and he's told German publication AMUS that in about 2 or 3 weeks' time, they should know the 6 sprint race locations. Interlagos has showed that the sprint race does work if we put the right program on the right tracks. That was the main criterion when we chose the 6 sprint locations for next year. Now, I, for one, am not quite sure where those races are going to be. I would argue that Austria, technically Austria could be on that list. Spa, yeah, that would be a good venue, I suppose, as well to have. Monza didn't really do it for me in 2021. That's probably why that's why they didn't have it for this year, in my opinion. They decided to go elsewhere with it. I don't think Imola really did it for us either. It could have done, but I think they just didn't really do it. I don't know where they're going to go for the other venues. I know for a fact that Interlagos is going to be there because it's the best one. It's been the best one 2 years in a row. I mean, ultimately, Corny, would you agree with what Ross Brawn was saying there? Is it important more than ever that if we're going to have sprint races on the F1 calendar that work, they have to be at races where we know there's a good chance that we're going to get some overtaking and some excitement?
Yeah, no, that's what Ross Brawn's been saying has been echoing what I've been saying about sprint races the whole time. It is very much dependent on the circuit, and also having a mix up between the old format qualifying and sprint races is good. Having that variety is a good thing, but I'm pleased that they're not just abruptly chucking in a new format like they did in 2016 when an awful qualifying format lasted like 3 races.
Yeah, that was fun.
So I'm glad they haven't just thrusted it in. They are being very experimental with it. I'm glad because it just seems that F1 fans have been really frustrated that we don't get listened to. And it just seems that with this sprint race format, we are being listened to. And I'm hoping that they do have sprint races at Brazil. But I just hope they choose the right tracks. So far so good with sprint races. It is a learning curve. There's obviously still work to be done. But yeah, please don't ruin some perfectly good weekends that we usually have with Monday sprint races because it doesn't work at certain circuits.
Yeah, you're right. And look, we know that this is something that F1 and Ross Brawn in particular, Liberty Media, they want to push. They want to, they want this to be a moneymaker for them, but they want this to be something that actually works for them. But I just don't feel that you have to have it for the sake of having it. It's more exciting than a practice session is not, for me, a good enough criterion for having sprint races on the calendar. It really isn't. So hopefully that they will pick better venues this year. As I said, Austria wasn't too bad. It was okay. Most of it came from the midfield, granted. Perhaps if Charles Leclerc had pushed a bit more in that race than he had done, like as he did in the main race, maybe he would have got Max Verstappen. We don't know. Imola was a bit of a ball fest. We did see Max go after Leclerc, but again, that was probably one of those where Max was a bit out of position and he was just trying to get his lead back. There are always good moments, but we want to see more of what we saw this weekend. That should be the standard. Maybe Brazil is the peak and we're not going to get that at other circuits, but I'm sure that we can find somewhere that's at least 60-70% as good as what we've seen in Brazil the last 2 seasons. So there's hope, but it was certainly a step in the right direction for sprint races. We can't go much longer on this podcast, Courtney, without talking about one of the highlights of this weekend, but ultimately not necessarily became a false dawn, but was ultimately overshadowed by the fact that his main race lasted such a short amount of time. Kevin Magnussen getting his first pole position. Haas's first pole position, the first Danish driver to get pole position, the 24th different nation to have a driver on pole position. I mean, yes, of course, people will say, yes, the conditions were changing. It was wet to dry and stuff like that. And ultimately, there was a small window in where these laps could be set. But you got to take your hat off to Kevin Magnussen in the circumstances. The conditions were the same for him as it were for everybody else. And when everybody had that one lap, he was the one that put the best lap in a Haas. So, I mean, what an incredible story for him and everyone at Haas, just to see the images, the clips, everyone beaming, everyone excited. The funniest part of it all was the fact that the whole grid was sandwiched between the two Haases because Mick Schumacher obviously got it wrong and started P20. But I mean, that's a great story for F1.
It's a great story for F1, and it's also a great story for Haas in particular. You know, they were Haas a couple seasons ago were considered the mean team. You know, so to go from that to obviously taking advantage of very unique circumstances and getting the pole position, it's one of those where nobody can take that away from them. You know, regardless of anything that goes on from now on, or the stuff that's happened between certain driver pairings and all that, they now have a pole position next to their name. So they're obviously going to be jubilant about that, and it might give them some kind of hunger to want some more. You know, sometimes you just get the feeling some of these teams in F1 are just there to make up the numbers, pick up the prize money, and just go about it season after season. So for them, again, it's going to be a moment that people on that team will cherish for a very long time. And who are we to begrudge them that? Congratulations to the team, because even though for fans of the bigger teams, it's just a pole position. For a team of that size and the recent history that they've had, that would be massive for them. So yeah, genuinely completely chuffed for the team, because it has been a tough few years for them.
Well, this is it, and it's all relative because, I mean, you can compare it to what we saw today with George Russell and Sir Lewis Hamilton. We saw a guy that had won 103 Grand Prix, 7 World Championships. There's not really anything in the sport that he hasn't already achieved, going up against a guy who was going for his first race win, who'd won the sprint race. But whilst that is obviously an achievement, is not going to go down in the record books of any significance. The relativity is there. George's reaction was incredible. The tears were in his eyes. He was, you couldn't describe how amazing he would have felt. The same way Sir Lewis would have done when he won his first Grand Prix back in Canada in 2007, all those years ago. With Kevin Magnussen today, the pictures were very, very different. He was very unlucky. But Friday afternoon, he'd have felt like the world champion. The Haas team would have felt like they'd won the world championship. But over a pole position, it's immaterial. Yes, they got a point in the sprint race, and I'm really glad that they got something out of that. This new format for the sprint has obviously been a success because it's allowed that. If it was the old format from last season, he'd have got nothing other than just a notch in history to say he got pole position. And also, to his credit, he does keep that. That pole position does count. They changed the format this year for it. Last year, they would have just said he was the speed king or whatever it was that they did. Do you remember that? Last season, they just stuck a reef around his neck and gave him a tour around the circuit in an open-top bus or something stupid like that they did last year. So it wouldn't have mattered at all. This year, however, it does. And Haas also got a point off of it, which is important because they're now 2 points ahead of AlphaTauri in the fight for P8 in the Constructors' Championship. It could have been more today. He was cruelly taken out of the race. Obviously, you can put the blame on Daniel Ricciardo. He was right. And if you want to say that, justice was done, Magnussen's carcass-like car, if you like, that just rolled off and hit Ricciardo and took him out of the race. So people could say, well, justice is done in that regard. But at least they got something from this weekend. And I couldn't think of a better bunch of men and women and everything else that comes with it in Formula One that deserves success like this, even if it's just celebrating a pole position, it means so much to these people. And it's wonderful stuff to see. It really does reinforce sometimes that in sport, even in Formula One, as predictable as it can be, the unpredictable can happen.
No, spot on. And again, I'm just so happy for the people in the team. And it just sums up this weekend. This weekend has been a complete breath of fresh air. And Kevin Magnussen was the cherry on the cake.
Yeah, absolutely. And it was really, really fun just to see Kevin's reaction as well. He hadn't stopped smiling. Probably not so much today, but really, really good stuff to see. Mick Schumacher obviously put in a decent performance today. He was just a bit unlucky not to get some points. Obviously, he wants to put in a good showing whilst his F1 career at this point in time is on the line. We may get some confirmation on what's happening with Haas next season, but if you're Mick Schumacher, would a year out, perhaps in a reserve driver role, perhaps a bigger team? I know Mercedes have been looking. I know Ricciardo's probably the likely candidate there, but perhaps an opportunity there might serve Mick a bit better for his development. I mean, this is a guy that we've often said has a lot to learn, but he's definitely a guy capable of doing it. Perhaps a year out of the pressures of driving on a week-by-week basis might help him.
I think it'd be difficult for him to get back into F1, given that he hasn't set the world alight during his time in F1. We've referenced Daniel Ricciardo saying that if he was to take a year away, he could get another chance because, he's a race winner. He's delivered on the big occasions. So he already has that next to his name, whereas Mick hasn't really done that yet. Of course, he has the potential, but I think if Mick is to take a break from F1, he's probably better off doing what Alex Albon did and take part in other racing categories just to keep your name sort of in and around the circle, to keep your name out there, because obviously you get drivers that disappear, they just go through the trapdoor and you don't see them again. What Mick needs to do, if he's hungry enough to come back into F1, he has to prove himself elsewhere. Yeah, again, to just keep himself in the loop.
Yeah, absolutely right. Couldn't agree more on that one. We should move on to other battles this weekend, other stories. McLaren versus Alpine, a ever-present story this season, which has taken so many twists and turns. It's almost impossible to predict where it's going to end up. This was, last weekend was a very good weekend for McLaren. It looked like it opened the door for them against Alpine. Reliability troubles and keeping both of their drivers happy when battling alongside each other, as we saw during the sprint race this weekend, and obviously how tensions came to the boil and drivers were saying this and quotes and this and everything else. It almost becomes impossible to manage. You felt like McLaren had the upper hand. Today, things unraveled very, very quickly to the point where it became a nightmare for McLaren, and Alpine recovered very, very well today. The gap now between them, 19 points in the Constructors' Championship in Alpine's favour with one race to go. Lando Norris having reliability troubles, despite the fact that he had that collision with Leclerc. He drove a solid race this today, and of course yesterday, getting points in the sprint race. McLaren are going to be absolutely gutted with how this is sort of unravelled for them. We talked about Alpine's reliability, but it was McLaren's reliability that let them down this weekend, and driver errors also.
I think Alpine will be ecstatic that they've come away with the advantage that they have, not only because the two McLarens had problems, but because both of their drivers came home. Because after what happened on the Saturday with the turmoil between the two drivers, very public. Even on the even on the race day itself, you had the management on the radio telling Ocon to behave himself, basically. So I think they'll be very happy that they've got the points haul that they have, because if you asked me before the weekend how that would have gone, I'd have expected it to have gone the other way. Quite interesting what happened with Daniel Ricciardo, because it seems that what he got away with last weekend come back against him this weekend, because he tried to do something similar that he did with Tsunoda in Mexico, and he paid the price for it. So when you talk about things sort of balancing out over the course of the season, we saw it happen very quickly with Daniel, and it just sums up McLaren's season, where, generally speaking, Daniel has kind of cost the team on various occasions. And as harsh as it sounds, it's moments like that which is probably why he's leaving the sport at the end of the season.
Yeah, I mean, it literally came back to bite him, quite literally, almost immediately. Yeah. And, you can't blame Kevin Magnussen, not that he meant to do this, but when the car veers off like that, he's in no control of what happens, and it just happened to hit Ricciardo and take him out of the race. It was a silly, we said last weekend or last time out in Mexico that it was a lapse of judgment on Ricciardo's part when he had that collision with Tsunoda. Same thing again this weekend on lap 1, got a bit too tentative. It was on the replays, it just looks a little bit embarrassing. On a driver of Ricciardo's obvious talent and caliber, I wouldn't have expected him to just run into the back of someone like Magnussen.
Yeah.
I know it gets quite slow in that area and it's almost a bit of a Constantina effect, but Ricciardo's no stranger to this. He's been around the block enough times to know where to put your car in those situations. So yeah, just a lapse in concentration. And it's cost, some potential big points, especially on a day like today, where he clearly had the car and had the pace to perhaps get involved in something. We saw a few strange results this weekend. On the talk of Alpine, on the subject of Alpine, I should say, you've obviously mentioned, Courtney, about the two drivers having a bit of a battle between the two of them. Once again, Alonso and Ocon just get so feisty with each other. And I would love to say that this is something that Esteban Ocon does everywhere he goes. He did this at Racing Point with Perez, but Alonso's no stranger to this either. And the stewards deemed that Alonso was at fault for the incident where they sort of came together down the back straight. I'm kind of inclined to agree with them in that regard. I think Alonso was just complaining, basically saying it was crazy defending from his teammate and that he doesn't need to talk to Ocon about his driving because he's only got one more race to go and then it's finally over, as if it's like a tumultuous task for him that he's had to endure this season. But to be fair, this weekend, I can't really say, even though Alonso got a great result in P5 ultimately, I can't really say that Ocon was the only driver at fault here. I mean, the team was saying on the radio to Ocon, like, you do not fight Fernando. Like, it got to a point where they're saying, like, be careful with your teammate, don't be silly. And Ocon basically responded along the lines of basically saying, look, I'm trying to catch so-and-so, I'm trying to get this position. Then they responded saying, we're going to make this clear to you, do not fight Fernando. Basically their version of the Fernando's faster than you, get out of the way. And it's crazy that we're talking about this now with these guys. I mean, there's a rivalry there. It's something that may carry on in future years when they're in separate cars. But it just seems with these two, everywhere they go, there's always controversy with their own teammate. You just have for whatever reason, they just can't work together. They have to be the alpha in this situation.
Yeah, and I think particularly Fernando Alonso, I've referenced it before, I think it's that kind of mindset that has cost him multiple world championships. The way that he gets very easily annoyed and gets very easily frustrated with the projects for the team that he's working for, leaves pretty much as soon as possible, and then the team that he leaves finds some form, finds some answers to their problems, and go on to become world champions. So Fernando's attitude that has been apparent this weekend has been responsible for, in my opinion, in terms of the talent that the guy has, he should have had at least 3 or 4 world championships alongside Sebastian Vettel. But his attitude has cost him. And again, this weekend's been an example of that.
Yeah, I mean, has Fernando Alonso ever left the Formula One race team in a positive manner? There always seems to be some lingering negativity or tension or controversy that seems to follow his exit. Granted, this time, it's not really one of his own doing. It's one of those few occasions where he's not talked himself out of leaving the team. He's found opportunities elsewhere that he feels is going to bear more fruits than it would be if he stayed, and that's fair enough. So I suppose this has been one of the more pleasant experiences, I suppose, for Fernando. It's not quite as pleasant as it was at Ferrari to a degree, but it's certainly not as bad as the 2 stints he's had at McLaren. And obviously not as good as the first stint at Renault either. But, that was a long, long time ago where he actually won world championships. So for anyone who can remember what that was like back at the time, that was rather harmonious compared to what we get right now. So it's going to be interesting. Alpine, at this point, they have been better than McLaren. The car's been better than McLaren. Yes, they've had reliability troubles, but the drivers collectively have done better than the pairing of Norris and Ricciardo, although I'd argue Norris has been the best driver out of the 4 of them by some distance in that regard. So I think Alpine will consider themselves quite fortunate that they don't have to worry about dealing with this, knowing that they're on the cusp of losing out in this battle. With a 19-point gap, it seems very likely that unless something crazy happens, like what we saw at Monza last season with McLaren, where they come 1 and 2, I think Alpine look like they may have this championship wrapped up for P4.
Yeah, it takes some very exceptional circumstances for that to happen. They can't rely on rain in Abu Dhabi. That's going to be almost impossible. So, yeah, it looks like Alpine have got this plan wrapped up. But you're right, they developed the faster car. Both drivers have been on it. It's just their biggest thing. Their biggest downfall has been in reliability. So I suppose that's the only jeopardy they have going into Abu Dhabi. If both Lando Norris and Danny Rick have strong weekends and both their Alpines, that have a reason, go out the race, that's going to be McLaren's path to winning that battle. But in terms of where they are now, with everything you sort of consider, it's definitely advantage Alpine.
Yeah, absolutely right. And obviously we'll have to wait and see how it goes. There's 5 points between Ocon and Alonso in the Drivers' Championship battle between them. And whilst, as you said, Courtney, Ocon seems to parade around this particular statistic, and he may continue to do so at the end of the season if he stays ahead of his illustrious teammate without any context whatsoever. And in some ways there's a fairness to that, because at the end of the day, it doesn't matter what context you have. You could argue a case that if Lewis Hamilton didn't have all the reliability issues that he had, he'd have beaten Nico Rosberg in 2016, or if it wasn't for Abu Dhabi, he'd have beaten Max Verstappen in 2022. 2021. I know I keep using Sir Lewis as an example. First one that comes to my mind, so I do apologise if you're tired of me talking about Sir Lewis in that regard as a measuring stick, I suppose, for these examples. But as it stands, we'll have to wait and see what happens. It's going to be interesting to see if that does factor into their minds, if they feel like the McLaren battle is over. All I can say for Alpine is that if you think things are interesting now, just wait and see who you put in your car alongside Ocon next season. That one is going to be very interesting to watch next season with Pierre Gasly. Speaking of Pierre Gasly, got a bit of a reprimand for driving unnecessarily slowly on the reconnaissance lap in the sprint race, and got a 5-second time penalty for speeding in the pit lane. Now, I can't remember off the top of my head if that comes with penalty points. I haven't seen any updates as of yet to suggest that any penalty points will be landed onto him. But bit strange that he's doing silly things like that when he's on the cusp of a race ban. And I don't want to say he's deliberately doing this to kind of wipe the slate clean before he moves teams, but if he isn't, he's not doing a very good job at trying to cover that up.
No, it doesn't seem subtle in the slightest. It's also just, it'd be really embarrassing for AlphaTauri to finish P9 in the constructors, and if he makes his kind of mistakes, they are going to finish P9 in the constructors. So look, I understand. Look, he's moving on to another team, but I think it's disrespectful to AlphaTauri. In the day, they were the team that gave him his chance when he could have ended up going out the shut door of Formula One altogether. And if he is, let's just say hypothetically speaking, he is doing it on purpose, it is disrespectful to the team, particularly as I say, it's going to be majorly embarrassing for them to finish so low in the Constructors' Championship, and that's very likely to happen if he's not there to race. So let's hope it's not true.
Yeah, I don't want to say that he's doing this on purpose, because obviously we don't want to be implying that drivers are deliberately trying to fix certain outcomes to suit certain narratives, that some people want to avoid. But he's obviously, in the last 3 races, racked up quite a few penalty points. I think it was 5 penalty points he'd racked up in the last 3 races before this one. And he's obviously been to the steward's office twice now, this weekend alone. So you do have to question what's going on with Pierre. He just says it's getting very difficult right now, all these things happening. But yeah, very, very strange one. Can't really put my finger on what's going on there. But I suppose only Pierre really knows. And we'll just have to wait and see if there's any update. I'd be very surprised, though, if the stewards did throw the book at him and say, no, you're going to have a race ban. It might be one where he's just going to be driving on eggshells, quite literally, when he joins Alpine next season. So we'll have to keep an eye on that one. We talked about inter-team battles. We should talk about Aston Martin briefly. What is going on with Lance Stroll at the moment? I've said that this is a guy that, in our chat on WhatsApp, that he either gets your points or he ends up retiring or causing an incident. We saw what happened in Austin, where it was very dangerous driving from him. Admittedly, Alonso was a bit too close to him. We did see that again this weekend with Ocon, so it's not like Stroll's the only one to blame there. But what he did with Vettel this weekend in the sprint, where he ran him off the road, just trying to defend a position. Crazy, crazy stuff from Lance Stroll. Really dangerous driver, not quite sure what's going on there. But then he pulls it together and gets a point for Aston Martin this weekend, which is a bit of damage limitation because Alfa Romeo did get a few more with Valtteri Bottas. So I suppose, the best and the worst of Lance Stroll coming out this weekend, Courtney.
Yeah, that was Lance Stroll in a nutshell. But I do think with Sebastian Vettel leaving at the end of the season and Fernando joining, maybe he's making a statement not only to his team but to himself that he wants to be a number one driver. So sort of putting his elbows out the way he did could well have been a statement. That I personally believe that was his mindset. But look, if he wants to be a team leader, he can't be behaving that way. And obviously, with his dad owning the team, he does have that benefit on his side in terms of when it comes to upgrades and decisions within the team. But I just think we're talking about Fernando Alonso. I can't wait to leave Alpine. I just can't see that dynamic working at Aston Martin. You've got a guy that loves to complain about the team that he drives for, going to a team where his dad owns the team. I just think we're talking about the Alpine situation becoming a mess. I can see the same happening at Aston Martin. You're going to have Sebastian Vettel, who's, you know, just enjoying the end of his F1 career so far and, focusing on environmental issues and human rights issues, sort of being quite laid back. He's going to go from having that kind of man as a teammate to Fernando Alonso. It's going to be the atmosphere of the Aston Martin team is going to be intriguing to say the least.
Yeah, no, absolutely agree with that, mate. Honestly, it's been a really, really interesting one to watch envelop. I mean, Sebastian Vettel, I've got to say, was really, really unlucky this weekend. Comes P11 in the main race, P9 in the sprint race, narrowly missing out on a point, which obviously would have been big for Aston Martin in the constructors. The gap now between them and Alfa Romeo, I believe, was it 5 points now between the two of them?
Sounds about right.
Yeah, so that could be pivotal. With one race left to go, those 2 points from Bottas could prove to be the final nail in the coffin for that battle. When we fought for a while, Aston Martin looked odds-on favourites to get in that position. And Seb, at one point in the race, was running P4 outright. I think he made a good overtake on Norris, and he was running P4 after all the chaos was going on between Verstappen and Hamilton.
Did he get messed up by the safety car? Because obviously we saw Perez did.
Yeah, so strategy, obviously, Aston Martin, I think they went wrong on strategy with Seb. They made him run a bit longer on his opening stint, which kind of compromised him a little bit because the undercut was very, very powerful here. And this is where the likes of Bottas, Gasly, Ocon all got ahead of him on the road. And on this particular track, in the midfield, track position was everything, and that really cost Vettel. And then again, as you mentioned later on, the safety car coming out when he did, that compromised Vettel on strategy also, and it took him out the top 10. I mean, Stroll ended up beating him today. Stroll was absolutely nowhere near his teammate all day long today, up until the end where the safety car came out. So you got to feel for Seb. He drove phenomenally well this weekend, deserved to get more than he did, but ultimately just come up short quite narrowly. One more race to go. Hopefully, it's a memorable one for Seb, and we can have a very happy ending to what has been a wonderful Formula One career. I'm loving seeing what Seb Vettel's doing right now in behind the car, behind the wheel. It's incredible stuff. It's just such a shame we're only going to be seeing it one more time. But that's life, unfortunately, guys. All good things must come to an end eventually. We should talk briefly about Alfa Romeo and Bottas in particular before we sign off for this week's episode. P9 for Valtteri Bottas. Quite impressed with the performance. Zhou Guan Yu, P12 in the main race. Neither of them were really anywhere to look at in the sprint. Obviously, Bottas coming in clutch at the end, but obviously rocking a new look as well with the moustache and letting the hair grow out. Very unlike Valtteri Bottas. Seems to have found a new look on him, and it's doing him some good. I mean, I don't want to say facial hair is, contributes to performance, but I remember Jenson Button letting his facial hair grow out, and he won a world championship with that look. So why not? Why not?
Yeah, no, I think with Valtteri, I was very vocal about the fact that he seems to have fallen asleep, but it seems the last few races, he's come to life. So maybe he's made some slight life changes that have woken him up a bit, and Alfa Romeo are getting exactly what they signed with Valtteri Bottas, getting the big results when it matters. So they're putting themselves in with a chance to taking themselves up the Constructors' Championship. So apart from at the front, we do have, further down the grid, we do have a lot of stake going into Abu Dhabi. So I suppose it's not all bad.
Yeah, very true. The funniest thing this weekend, I think, as far as Alfa Romeo were concerned, is they are the first F1 team, as a team, to be investigated by the stewards in an actual race.
Yeah.
This was weird because it came up on the graphics saying the Alfa Romeo team were being investigated by the stewards for a pit lane infringement. I'm like, what have they done in the pit lane to incur the stewards to have a look at what they've done? And according to Ted Kravitz at Sky F1, he basically said that obviously something that happens in the pit lane is when teams and drivers have pits, people in adjacent pit lanes ahead of them, often as a courtesy, not a rule, move their wheel guns out of the way in the tethers that they're attached to allow easier access out of the pit lane for the drivers in the pit boxes behind them at other teams. Apparently, according to Ted Kravitz, this wasn't really adhered to by the Alfa Romeo team. Now, there's no rivalry between Haas and Alfa Romeo right now. I mean, obviously, there's a battle of the Ferrari customers, if you like, between the two of them, if you could kind of clutch at straws to find a rivalry between the two of them. So there was absolutely no reason for a competitive position for Alfa Romeo to do anything to try and compromise them. Also, because it's not a rule, based on what we've been told, there's no obligation for Alfa Romeo to move the wheel guns out of the way to make it easier to access. I mean, we saw something similar, I think it was at Zandvoort, when Perez ran over one of the Ferrari wheel guns by accident. Of course, nothing was made of that because the pit lane is so small and so narrow this thing could happen. But yeah, very strange one indeed, Courtney. I don't think I am expecting any sort of competitive punishment to be levered at them, but I've seen stranger things in Formula 1, but it was definitely up there, one of the weirdest ones, seeing a team being investigated by the stewards during the race.
Yeah, I think it was an example of, like when like certain kids were like messing about behind the teacher's back, and the teacher looks around and goes, "I see you. I know what you're up to. Carry on. You're in trouble." I reckon it was a bit of that. Like, even though a rule wasn't broken, it is a little bit naughty, and I just think that was a steward's way of letting the team know we see what you're doing. Don't do it anymore. So I think it was, I think it's a bit of that, to be honest.
Yeah, I mean, for all we know, it could have been just a health and safety thing. Like, it's something that all of the teams do if they know that their immediate rivals behind them are pitting in the pit lane garage. They just like, someone get out there, just make sure they move those out of the way. Or there's someone out there in case that happens. Maybe it's just one of those times where that person forgot or was really needing the loo or fancied a coffee during the race and they just, they were there and it just didn't happen. I don't know. We'll have to see the footage. I'm sure someone put a picture of it on social media. I'm not going to scour right now through because be here all night doing this podcast. It's long enough already. So, yeah, we'll see in the coming days and we'll probably talk about this a bit in Abu Dhabi if it makes a little bit more sense of what's going on or, proves to be a bit more newsworthy perhaps than it's being given at the moment. Who could blame them, given all of the topics and stories that not only we've covered in this podcast episode for this weekend, but everything that's gone on this weekend. It's certainly been a classic, one that will live long in the memory of George Russell, no less. And of course, I'm sure many of you listening at home on YouTube or your favourite podcasting platform. And I think that's a great way for us to sort of end this show for this weekend. I hope you guys have enjoyed it. As always, if you want to support us, you can do so on YouTube by liking the video and subscribing to the channel. Of course, if you follow us in your favourite podcasting platform, you can give us a 5-star review. And if you do so, we'll give you a shout out on the next episode. But do let us know if you do not listen on Apple Podcasts, because we can't see your review. If you're giving us a 5-star one, let us know on our socials. We'll give you a shout out on the next episode as a reward for your continuous support and patronage to DNF1. Well, all that's left to say, Courtney, is thank you so much for joining me on this episode of the show. And guys, thank you so much as well for tuning in. Feel free to comment on all of the talking points that we have talked about in this episode. We've got one more race to go before the season finale in Abu Dhabi. There are still plenty of stories and arcs and sagas left to be resolved. Not necessarily the World Championship that we got last season, but plenty more stories to resolve before the 2022 season is out. It's been an absolute blur this season, Courtney. We've got one race to go. We've had a Mercedes win this season, something that I think we all thought was not going to happen. And we didn't expect it to happen at Brazil. It has done. Is there really much more that we could ask for this season that we haven't already got? We've had so much already.
Sebastian Vettel winning his last ever F1 race.
Oh, yes, let's get it. I think at the very least, I think the most we can hope for is probably Seb getting driver of the day. Guys, if you are listening to this show and you do vote on the F1 Driver of the Day panels, I've never ever voted on this poll. I'm just one of them people that just sees it. I'm like, okay, cool. I never actually vote on anything like that. If you do, let's all vote for Seb Vettel Driver of the Day. Let's give him what he deserves, a nice little sign off to say thank you for the memories. It's not going to mean much in terms of an overall achievement, but as a gesture, I think it's something that F1, sometimes in sport, we all come together at the right moments and do the right thing. That, I feel, regardless of what happens next weekend, good things that matter, of course, that Seb Vettel gets that nice little bit of love from the F1 fans. So let's see if we can make that happen. But until then, guys, all that's left to say is thank you so much for tuning in. Thank you, of course, for your continuous support. We really, really do appreciate it. But before we head into the final preview, all that's left to say is stay safe. Thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you in the next episode of the DNF1 F1 podcast for the final Grand Prix of the season. Until next time, remember one thing: if you're not first, you're probably DNF1. Take care.
See you soon.